few months back, I did a video called The Secrets of Skinwalker Ranch. And in that video, I got a comment from someone, and I appreciated this comment. Said that I needed to look at the Haunted Cosmos podcast and reach out to the guys over there. And 11 months later, they're like 4 seasons in, and I'm pretty well hooked. If you haven't checked out their podcast, it's great. Story, narrative, and biblical worldview kind of all come together. My kids love it. And so when I reached out to Ben Garrett, I was thrilled that he was interested in coming on my podcast and sort of talking about his experience co-hosting Haunted Cosmos, the sort of Christian worldview aspect of this, and how podcasting ties into ministry, the nature of the Bible, and mythical history that we seem to be rediscovering and sort of being re-enchanted by. So I really enjoyed my time with Ben. It's an encouraging conversation, and I'm glad you're here with us. I'd love to get your comments because, as you see, just the simple act of participation, leaving a comment, can actually move things, which is kind of cool. Little innocuous comment. William, thank you for leaving it. Maybe you didn't think of it at the time that it would lead to this conversation. So I'm glad you're with us. Let's get into it. As I've listened to you and Brian talk and engaged a little bit with your content, um, the thing that kind of that would be interesting for you and I maybe to have a conversation around would be kind of the reenchantment
Mhm.
that I'm seeing, at least like sort of there's this sort of Christian reenchantment that maybe the internet is allowing us to be a little bit more aware of. Maybe it's always
Yeah.
been there. I'd love to get your thoughts on that. Um, and 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 kind of this like even how podcasting is sort of shaping ministry. So you are full time kind of podcasting at this point, right?
Yeah, on paper, I am a full-time podcast producer, uh, and, in reality, I do about 20 hours a week, with the church as well
Okay.
that we're located at, but yeah, I mean, it's, a solid 40 hours a week minimum of
Right.
podcast stuff.
Right, but you've got a nice blend of, like, you're kind of online and you're in this digital space, but you're also in just, like, embodied space as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. In a real space surrounded by a bunch of people, friends that I can, hit and who
Right?
can hit me, so
Yeah, yeah. Well, and it's something, that I've explored a little bit on my podcast, because it seems like there's a bit of a phenomenon, like, I'm paying attention to Joe Rogan and Russel Brand and Jordan Peterson and all that stuff, right? And it seems like there's sort of a almost like a draw, like a Christian curiosity that comes, like, even Russell Brand just, like, recently became a Christian,
yeah.
and I don't know, like, you couldn't prove that there's something in this podcasting, um, tool that we're using, but there's something in exchanging dialogue. There's something
Yeah.
in a dialogue that to me just rings true of the gospel. The Gospel of John in particular. The Word becomes flesh,
Yeah.
dwells amongst us, right? And so we're we're hearing more conversations as society has become more individuated, um, and yet there's still this missing element of like we're exchanging breath
Mhm.
when we're in space together, when we're in physical space together. um, Dialogue has this, I don't know, like, and maybe you could tell me I'm crazy or whatever, but like there's this, the word becomes flesh. It becomes embodied and we exchange words, breath, all that. And I don't know. So like where do you think we are with that? Like
Yeah,
is
I
is there
mean
something to dialogue? Is there something to like your experience with podcasting from a church standpoint, church ministry standpoint?
yeah, I think that's a really fascinating topic because di speaking out loud, not
Yeah.
even dialogue, it presupposes some form of community.
Mhm.
You can and I'm kinda like this, if I'm trying to work something out, talk out loud, you know? I talk to myself sometimes. It's a little embarrassing. Um, but even in your prayer, if you're praying
Mm.
out loud, which I would recommend everyone do, you're communing. You're communing with the Lord.
Mm.
And then when you look at the history of sort of story and how stories were passed down, and then you had this age of the radio, and then this age of
Yeah.
the television, and now you have this age of the podcast.
Yeah.
And we keep going back to this oral tradition that man is
Mm.
very adept at, where when Homer was composing the Iliad and the Odyssey, and when he actually like wrote it down, it was this tradition that he was feeding off
Mm.
of bards that would tell the story of the war in Troy, and they would tell the story of the hero Odysseus going home, and then Virgil kind of grapples with that idea when he writes his Aeneid, and
Yeah.
and I say all that to say, like, when we're hearing stories and when we're hearing any sort of word spoken, whether it's a story or just like data points that people are talking about,
Mhm.
it presupposes the communal nature of man, that it's
Yeah.
not good for man to be alone. He's
Yeah.
hearing voices that are outside of himself. Uh, and you even see that in the preaching of the word,
Mhm.
how, every Christian, it's the priesthood of all believers. Every Christian ought to have access to the scriptures. They ought to read the scriptures diligently and love them. But they also ought not neglect the preaching of the word, the hearing of the word. And the faith that's cultivated in the regenerate heart is a faith that comes by hearing.
Right.
And so then if you so there's something really important about speaking, and there's something really important about hearing that word
Yeah.
spoken. And I think that you're seeing that kind of be recaptured in man moving from a world where radio was really like the only form of sort of mass entertainment. And during the time of radio's rise, around like C.S. Lewis's time, for
Mhm.
example, you still had a communal, like, human body. People were
Right.
not so individualistic yet. It was
Right.
getting there. It was
Yeah.
on the way, but it wasn't quite there yet. It
Right.
hadn't metastasized as much
Yeah.
as it has now.
Yeah.
Then you have television. The onset of television is like an indictment on the individualism that
Right.
began with the French Revolution, and the severing of man from the society that he's a part of. And now you have podcasts. Now,
Mhm.
the good thing about podcasts is that they show that, well, man is still man. He still craves
Yeah.
this communal sharing of ideas, this
Mhm.
communal sharing of words that's severed from this like artificial image of those words on a television, but that is organic, and it's coming from a real mind, and it's not the conglomeration of a bunch of authors coming together to make stuff up. It's
Yeah.
actually
Yeah.
just someone's idea. The
Yeah.
danger, though, is that, and we this is where it ties into stuff that we've seen at the church. Not necessarily at my church, but when we go to conferences or
Mm.
when people visit, there can sometimes be a risk of listening to a podcast, but listening to it all alone and
Mhm.
thinking that you're now part of the conversation.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and some of that is like a good, like, I think that my friends do this well with the King's Hall. There's
Mhm.
a good podcast will invite you in to a
Yes.
seat at the table to
Yeah.
it'll make you feel like you are part of the
Yeah.
conversation. But there's a difference between getting the sense that you're there and actually thinking that you are there and that you now know these people.
Right.
So anyway, I think that
Mm.
I think that one of the areas for exhortation to believers in this podcast ministry era
Yeah.
is uh, is to not neglect the communion of the saints.
Yeah.
To make
Yeah.
sure that you don't supplement real human interaction and in the actual hearing and sharing of words that are
Yeah.
becoming flesh
Yeah.
with online voices.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got 2 thoughts coming off that. One is, where is common grace in this process, right? So I'm thinking of Russel Brand, Jordan Peterson, Joe Rogan, these sort of mega podcast voices, cultural voices that seem to be at least Christian curious, you know? So is there something just in sort of like common grace, like just sharing conversation that there's little grains of truth here and there, and the more you
Mm,
hear it, you sort of start to put the breadcrumbs together that sort of leads you
to Christ from all these different places. Part of the reason my podcast is called Strange Theology is it seems like there's theology happening in all these like strange places you wouldn't otherwise have expected them, like on Joe Rogan or whatever.
Yeah.
Um, and then the other is, and I've asked some of my other friends this who engage in sort of podcasting. There's actually a whole sort of group of YouTube channels that gets together to sort of participate in exactly what you were talking about, which is you could sit back and just listen to a podcast and imagine that you're participating in it without really participating.
Mhm.
But in physical space, it's sort of like you sort of have to participate on some level.
Yeah.
You can't be truly passive if you're sharing physical space with other people. You can not say anything,
Yeah.
but you're still kind of there.
Yeah.
Um, a- and and so I wonder about, and this goes back to exchanging breath, right? So if we're talking and we're in the same space, we're sort of sharing breath, as like kind of gross as that sounds. But we're sort of, there's like this, and breath is sort of tied to the idea of spirit. And so at least ancient people would say, like, this is how we know the difference between something that's
Mhm.
living moves, and something that's living has breath. So
Mhm.
there's connection to sort of life, and um, so there's that. But as for Christians, so, and maybe this would tie the whole thing together. There's this sort of common grace aspect of it, but then there's this, the same spirit that raised Christ Jesus from the dead is in me.
Mhm.
The same spirit is in all Christian believers, is in you. And so even though we're separated we're physically separated, there's still a shared spirit.
Yeah.
If you will. Which, so is there something to like there is, and I agree, you don't wanna neglect meeting together, but is there like a superpower? Do like Christians have a superpower when it comes to something like this? I don't know. There's my
Yeah. No,
ideas. You
no,
take
I
it and run with it.
those are really good. I wanna make sure I don't, like, forget.
That's okay. We'll
Uh,
circle back. I mean, that's the
yeah,
way
yeah.
conversations work, right?
Yeah,
You
no,
kind of
no doubt. You know how, like, you're talking to someone and they say something, you're like, "Oh my goodness, I wanna say something."
right.
No, that's great. I think in the my instincts with the common grace thing a
Yeah.
are, I'm fairly generous with common grace.
Yeah.
I think that I think that all of human history, including, pagan history, up to and including the time of Christ, was pointing towards Christ.
Yeah.
I think that Plato and Aristotle had a lot of insights about the spiritual world that pointed towards Moses, and
Mm,
Moses was pointing towards Christ.
mm.
I think that I think that Virgil's what is it, his fourth eclogue is like a messianic prophecy
Right.
of a pagan. I mean, genuinely, it's astonishing. Um, and so, and the reason that I think that is because sin is a privation of the good. Sin is
Mm,
always just a privation of something that already exists. Bavinck puts it this way. I think it's great. He says, "Sin isn't; it wants to be." Uh,
mm,
Sin doesn't have an essence of existence in itself. It's
mm.
a twisting of something that's already there. And one of the ways that you can work through that idea in regards to language and community and words is to say that the universe was made with the word. It
Yeah.
was God speaking,
Yeah.
and that was the genesis of everything. And not only was it God speaking, but it was God speaking in the Logos.
Mhm.
So it was this divine rationality, this divine being that's using the Logos, the word,
Hmm.
of all of it, like of all life to bring life into existence. And so
Mm.
that then means that there's genuine power in words.
Yeah.
Words carry a lot of weight,
Yeah.
Um, what and so part of what I think that means is that you have guys like Plato and Aristotle and Sophocles and Virgil and all these pagans who I mean had horrible and sinful
Mm.
ideas mostly,
Right.
but who also nonetheless by nature of being human and made in God's image, uh, participated in some things and had
Mm.
some ideas that genuinely pointed to
Yeah.
truth, beauty, and goodness that was far transcendent of maybe anything that they even intended. And in the same way, now that are living in a world that's post resurrection, um, that still applies. It's just that now
Mm.
the common grace of words point back to something
Right.
instead of
Right.
pointing towards something.
Yeah.
So because of that, I think that you can have guys like Jordan Peterson. I think that
Mhm.
you can have guys like Joe Rogan, and God writes the best stories. This UFC commentator who's like a cut rate comedian actually ends up talking about things on his show that are probably more important than he realizes.
Yeah.
And, you have a
Yeah.
Jungian psychologist who's married to a Roman Catholic
Right.
who is talking about things that are far more important than I think he realizes, though
Yeah.
he's probably starting to realize. And I
Mhm.
think it is a common grace operating where these men, by nature of sharing ideas and words with other men, are inevitably going to stumble on things because we live in
Mm.
God's world
Right.
that points back to the ultimate image of goodness, truth, and beauty.
Yeah.
And the reason that we can count on that is because sin is a privation of the good.
Right.
So those men, when they are sinning, in the same way that when we're sinning, they're not operating according to some different nature. They're still men,
Mhm. Mhm.
but they're men under a privation of something that they're
Mhm.
supposed to be. So yeah, I don't know if that made any sense, but that's where my mind goes,
Yeah.
thinking, but then the other thing that you said, remind me again, because that
Oh, I
was
was talking about the shared spirit, right?
yeah, okay,
So
because that
so we're
yeah,
not in the same physical space, and yet
yeah,
the same
okay,
spirit.
yeah. So I think, I first of all, I think there's obvious truth to that. Like,
Right.
there's a spiritual unity that I have with you,
Mm.
that even surpasses the spiritual unity that I have, with a blood relative that is not a Christian, right? Because
Right.
we're saved by the same Spirit, we're now
Mhm.
indwelt by the same Spirit,
Mhm.
and we're washed in the same blood. So even though we don't have the same blood in our veins, we've been cleansed by the same blood, and I think
Yeah.
that that really does mean something, and I think that it manifests itself in, in physical unity
Yeah.
and sort of like, friendly kinship that can be a little bit easier to get into.
Yeah.
However, I think on the other side of that, we can tend to we can tend to androgynize the physical because of the unity of the spirit.
Mm.
What I mean by that is that I still have more in common earthly in terms of like earthly things
Mhm.
with my cousin, this
Mhm.
non-existent cousin who's not a Christian.
Right.
I still have more in common with them in terms of earthly things than I do with you.
Right.
We were, born in the same place, raised in the same place. We
Right.
know
Right.
the same people. We were around the same family culture. We
Right.
have similar particularizations that would maybe allow us to get along long term, potentially even better than a
Yeah.
Christian that I've never met, even a Christian that looks and talks like me.
Mm.
And that's not guaranteed, but it is possible. And so I think that when we're talking about like unity of spirit, not neglecting the communion of the saints, I do think that the point still stands. If someone is getting their Christian community
Yeah.
online, they
Right.
are not getting their Christian community. They're
Right.
not doing it. We
Yeah.
have to be indwelt. We have to be flesh and
Yeah.
blood.
Yeah.
And it's because grace perfects and restores nature. It doesn't undo
Right.
nature
Right.
or turn
Right.
it into something that it's not. So
Yeah. Yeah.
the spiritual unity should be a thing that feeds into greater and greater earthly and physical, and like geographic unity, if you
Mhm.
want to get really carnal with it.
Well, no, I think that's tr so I've been working in Christian ministry for 25 years or so, and
Mhm,
I first, um, I didn't grow up in the church, and so, I didn't know, like, what church do I, belong to or whatever, and so I just became a missionary, and so I sort of belonged to this global mobile church, and I really did see a view of the church as a missionary that I think was really precious. And I think I kind of lost that a little bit because I
mhm,
started working for a particular church, and that's where I spent most of my time, and it became sort of like my whole Christian experience was through this one maybe denomination or this one particular church. And then I'm starting to see this again online where it's like, oh, so this group of YouTube channels and podcasters and stuff. I mean, there's just people from all over the Orthodox,
Yeah.
Protestant, Catholics. There are atheists, non-believers.
Yeah.
There are Jewish people that they all come together to have these conversations. And then the next thing that they do, or at least what they try to do, is meet in physical space. They have these
Mhm.
estuaries, is what it's called, where, sort of salt water mixes with fresh water. And and my thought, and I don't know if this is true because a lot of my time sort of podcasting and existing online hasn't yet led to like in-person meetings or anything like that. And
Mhm.
certainly there's sort of like a caution for that as well. It's like, um, but my thought, and I actually saw this as a missionary, is that relationships formed much faster and formed deeper when I was working as a missionary than they did when I was working maybe in just like a congregational setting.
Mm.
And I think part of that was a shared meaningful experience that we were on. But it was also that it was the Spirit. It was the Spirit of God
Yeah.
bringing these people together. Everybody had this shared calling. We had a shared focus, and we, sweat and bled for each other to try to accomplish, the task that we were on. And what's really interesting is, though I haven't met some of these people in person, I do feel like a sort of like a similar kinship. It's
Yeah.
like, I think I really understand this person. Now, that might be an illusion because I don't share physical space with this person, but, it is interesting that, I guess, I wonder if community or relationship is needing to be more clearly defined as. And so currently I work in student ministry. So I'm a director of student ministry. Um, and and what I see with students is it, that they do have a type of community online.
Yeah.
It's different than what we're talking about with physical space.
Right.
And you need both. I would say, not need. I mean, you don't need online community.
But
um,
you can use it for something beneficial, I
and
think.
it seems like it's being used to bring people back together as society has sort of become more and more individuated, as we've
Mhm.
scaled up into like a global society. We're stretched, right? And people are busy. So, it used to be that maybe, I don't know, 75 years ago, you'd come home from work, you'd sit on your front porch, right? You'd grill, neighbors would come over, there would be this sort of chit chat going on, and there was more community just shared in physical space. And now it's like, the barbecue that was on the front porch has moved to the back porch.
Yeah.
Now
Right.
you drive into your garage, you don't park outside, you walk from the garage to the house. You never, it's like you don't have to go outside.
Yeah.
And so we've become more and more individuated. And yet here we are finding a new way to sort of build community in a different way.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's
No,
an,
I also think too, like, and I think that it is important to distinguish between a sort of ministerial
mm,
community and a sort of everyday like neighborhood type community
yeah,
where like I mean you've experienced this as a missionary the when you increase difficulty and when you increase discomfort and irregularity, people tend to come together quicker
right.
because they don't really have much other comforts to
Mhm,
flock to. You know
mm,
what I mean? Like
mm,
when you're both in a city that you don't know or in a country that you don't know or just around people in an environment that you don't know, you
mhm,
are
mhm,
uncomfortable.
yeah,
Um, and I think that
mm,
it's a gracious act of God in situations like that that are missionary situations. The people that are there with the same goal but
yeah,
that are both equally uncomfortable, find comfort in one another
yeah,
faster than say a established church in, Tennessee or Georgia,
Right.
where they've been there for a few decades. They have all the same creature comforts of any other American. They can go home and they can rest on the couch. They can drink a beer on the front porch. They can do all the same things that every other American is comforted by. They can watch football.
Yeah.
You know, and so that means that one of the ways that I think relationships and community is tested in a domestic ministerial situation is by time and endurance.
Hmm.
This has been my experience with our
Yeah.
church here. Like I showed up here at Refuge about 6 years ago,
Okay.
and over the course of that 6 years, it's been a slow cooking process
Hmm.
of becoming closer and closer and closer with these men that I now consider my best friends
Hmm.
and that I would do anything for these guys, and they have done everything for me. You know what I mean? Like,
Hmm.
but it took time to get there, and I think
Yeah.
part of it is because we were comfortable. It was a new state for me, sure, but it wasn't that different. I still had my wife with me. Like,
Right.
there were a lot of comforts. It wasn't new for them at all. I was just
Right.
like some new guy coming in to something that they've been doing for almost 2 decades already at that point.
Yeah.
So everyone was comfortable. And so I think that it takes endurance to form a communal bond in that setting, more so than in like a war setting is really easy to
Mm.
draw a comparison from. Because
Yeah.
it's guys that are going into this setting that not only is it uncomfortable, but it's outright dangerous. And of course, mission work is that.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
spiritual battle on the front lines. Um, and so the only comfort that you have is the person that you're there with. So I think that, and that honestly, I don't want it to sound like it's cheapening the relationship. It's not. If
Mhm.
anything, like the bonds formed in the fray of war is stronger
Mm.
than a bond formed over many years in a comfortable setting.
Right.
Like it takes more time in the comfortable setting to
Mhm.
get to that
Mhm.
level of kinship. Does that make sense? So I think, and I say all that to say, like, both are totally valid, and I
Yeah.
think both are
Yeah.
operating all the
Yeah.
time, at different levels. But I do think it's important to distinguish the 2 and say
Yeah.
that, depending on what setting you're in, you should expect friendship to come a little easier, if it's a more desperate situation, scare quotes around
Right.
desperate, than
Right.
if it's a more casual, comfortable
Yeah.
situation. Friendship will probably be harder.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting, with regards to the sort of the conversation about ministry online, how, podcasting, how's podcasting maybe shaping the future of Christian ministry and stuff like that. I think that there is certainly a, a degree of comfort, right? I can just show up and listen. No one's intruding on me. I found your podcast or some other podcast or something, and I just like my curiosity brought me there. And
Mhm.
so I don't have to really become vulnerable at that moment like you
Yeah.
would in a physical setting,
Yeah.
like if I go to a church, if I whip myself up. It's like, look, I got 2 days off and I'm going to take one of those days and I'm going to get up early and I'm going to drag my kids to church and we're going to give it a good old college try. I've got to kind of get a little uncomfortable to do that. Now, is it as uncomfortable as someone fighting a war? No. But there's a level of exposure and vulnerability that you have just like sort of showing up to a new church than obviously just finding a new podcast. So there's that part of it.
Yeah, yeah.
And I wonder if part of the thing that we're learning, and I speak, sort of specifically from what my biblical Christian worldview, as I think about digital ministry or digital missionary work or whatever you want to call it. I mean, for me, it's just I just like having conversations and
Yeah,
sort
yeah.
of geek out about the Bible and stuff like
Yeah.
that. And if people want to listen to those things, great.
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
glad
I
you're
I
here.
like talking to Brian about,
Um,
Bigfoot and aliens, and
well, and that too, like that too.
we just figured
Um,
we'd record it.
yeah, exactly. Which I do want to get to kind of the genesis of Haunted Cosmos at some point here, but with so here would be my encouragement for any sort of Christian who's online, who's maybe even just sort of like I do this as a hobby. Like this is today's my day off, so I'm sort of do podcasting things because I just like it. I just enjoy it.
Yeah.
Um, and I think if we do this well, now I learned recently that Richard Dawkins has a podcast because I made a comment on the platform formerly known as Twitter. Um, that if Richard Dawkins were to engage in sort of a podcast, he might change his view on God or Christianity or something like that. And somebody commented, like, actually, Richard Dawkins has a podcast, and it's not very interesting.
Mhm.
And I think what makes interesting podcasts interesting, one of the secret ingredients is vulnerability.
Mm.
Is again, it's not the type of vulnerability that I would need to get myself ready to go to church on a Sunday morning, even though it's my day off and I could do whatever I wanted to. But if I'm going to do this well, if I'm going to participate with this well, I do need to become a little bit vulnerable. And I think that's what makes good content good. When I listen to you and Brian talk, you're like I get the sense that you're pushing yourselves to the edge of your comfort zone. You're like, are
Yeah.
we gonna talk about Bigfoot as a fairy? And then try to as a Christian, I'm gonna try to make sense of that. And I'm gonna put that out on the internet,
Yeah.
and people are going to ridicule me
People
for
that
my
already don't like me.
people people that already
I'm
don't like
I'm
me.
just giving fuel to their fire.
I've just given them all kinds of content, and they can clip it, and they
Yeah.
can reuse it, and they can quote it, and they can post it online and show people how silly I am or how ridiculous my ideas are. And that's, I think, what makes some of it interesting.
Yeah.
I think that to the Richard Dawkins example, it's like if it's just Richard Dawkins reinforcing his own ideological stance, I'm not interested in that.
Right.
But if Richard Dawkins opens up, I mean, I think he interviewed Ayaan Hirsi Ali recently or something like that. It's like if Richard Dawkins starts to open up, that's when it gets interesting. And when he starts to open up and become a little bit vulnerable, that's when I think you were talking about, the whole world is made from the word of God. Like God spoke
Yeah.
reality into existence. When you begin to engage with the logos, the dialogos, right? Um, I don't know. It's transformative. It seems like it's transform when you do it well. I think the
Yeah.
podcasts that aren't really doing it well, eventually, they fall away or whatever. But I'd be really curious to see where sort of Christian podcasting is 10 years from now or something like that. Um, because I don't know, I guess again, my encouragement would be that we as Christians can become vulnerable in the bright light of day, where everybody can look at my crazy ideas and say what they think about them,
Mhm.
and then I maybe reform those ideas into a more clear belief about who God is,
Yeah.
or something like that. So
I think too, or I wonder, um, that got me thinking about why is Richard Dawkins' podcast not interesting? Because I mean, I'm sure you'd agree, like, he's an interesting guy. Um, but what you're saying about vulnerability, I think that I understand. I think that initially I was misunderstanding the word,
hmm,
but it seems like something maybe part of what you mean is words become compelling when they're high stakes,
yeah,
when it asks something of you. It's
mhm,
not just it's not just like air that doesn't really matter or add to anything.
right.
And that got me thinking, okay, Richard Dawkins, what was the most interesting thing that Richard Dawkins has done in the last 20 years? Well, it was the other day when he tweeted about how he misses cultural Christianity.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and everyone's like, what the heck does that even mean? Why, um, and and it makes me wonder, okay, what about Jordan Peterson? Well, people
Mm,
really started to pay attention to Jordan Peterson when he started to be honest about his view, his sexual ethic,
yeah.
about even his questions about Christianity, about his
Mhm,
more
mhm.
conservative, right wing type ideas, about cleaning your room, instead of being an activist, right?
Yeah.
Uh, Joe, people started really talking about Joe Rogan anytime one of his guests would bring up something fringe, outside of the zeitgeist, outside
Yeah.
of the commonly
Yeah.
accepted view of what's right and wrong or true or false.
Yeah.
And so I think that part of the effectiveness of a podcast or any media, it slightly depends on what is and what is not generally accepted in the world around you. If
Mhm.
your media is
Mhm.
going to do something productive beyond merely entertainment, then it has to chafe against the goads
Yeah.
of the world. I think.
Mm.
Or at least that's what I'm thinking right now.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
and
if we try to take that to its conclusion, and again, like I'm shooting from the hip,
yeah.
um, I would entertain the idea that a goal of Christendom
Yeah.
should be that podcasts don't do very well in 500 years. Christian podcasts don't do very well in 500 years because it would perhaps indicate that the world is being more and more positively affected by the gospel, and there
Right.
are incredibly healthy communities of churches and
Right.
believers forming all over the place. So they don't need, you know, a podcast. They already have what they need. This is why honestly, like, and I don't say this to disparage podcasts because I think that they're, I mean, I do it. Like I think it's super valuable. I would have to be a real charlatan to not like podcasts.
Yeah.
But I at the same time, I don't listen to them. I don't really listen to podcasts.
Right. Right.
And part of why is because I I'm like, the reason that I would listen to a podcast is to either get information or feel like I'm able to bond with somebody, you know? And the
Mm.
thing is, I'm like, well, I'd rather get the information maybe from audiobooks, unless I need a lot of it distilled down in a quick
Yeah.
time. And then like I, listen to YouTube videos or podcasts for that for sure.
Yeah.
But in terms of the community, like I have all the community that I want. And it honestly, like, all of them are in the
Mhm.
offices right next to
Mhm.
me. Like, I get to hang out with these guys every day that I love so much. I and so some of it really is, like, I want more people to have that. I want more
Mm.
people to be able to walk 10 feet, and they're in their best
Yeah.
friend's office, and they're
Yeah.
talking, and they're figuring stuff out. I want more spheres of life, school, work, church, recreation. I want more of those spheres to be overlapping for more people
Mhm.
so that maybe they can use a podcast for more purely like informational purposes. And then as the gospel propagates through the world, um, even the informational podcasts aren't as necessary. I don't know. Like I said, I'm
Yeah.
totally shooting from the hip.
No, it's interesting because yeah, I mean, I think what I'm hearing you say is like part of the reason maybe Christian and I don't know, like I don't have a chart or a graph in front of me. I don't know how popular Christian podcasting is compared to others. I'm sure
Sure.
there's, you know, very popular podcasts out there dealing with some pretty, content that would certainly not glorify God.
Yeah.
Um and sort of getting people's attention that way. But it's interesting because it's sort of unconventional at this moment in history.
Yeah.
Not we've come through kind of this, post-enlightenment modern, modernity, rationalism, and not that, you know, Christianity is not rational, but it's just like there's a we admit that we don't have everything figured out. How
Yeah.
could we?
It's
We
rational, but it's not rationalism.
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, um, so it's sort of interesting, like, and your podcast is interesting because, maybe in the same way Jordan Peterson is interesting because you're sort of hearing what you thought was a familiar story in a new way. Like
Hmm.
Jordan Peterson will take Jonah or Cain and Abel, and he'll sort of wax eloquent, and then people kind of go, "Huh, I
Mhm.
never thought about it that way. I just never thought." And he has his sort of Jungian way of talking about it. I think
Yeah.
it can get people from the place of being sort of a scoffer, where it's like, "Oh, that's just the Bible is just ridiculous stories," to like, "Oh, actually, this is." really, I've never thought of it. It's a multi-dimensional sort of thing,
Yeah.
that I never appreciated before because society has just been telling me it's a bunch of fairy tales.
Right.
Dismiss. Um, and so then, like, you have a podcast that, in a way, does something similar. It's just like, huh, I never thought about it that way. And in a, like, let's just say dragons. We'll just take it.
Sure. Yeah.
What's your favorite subject so far? You've done 4, or you're working on the 4th season of Haunted Cosmos
Yeah.
now?
Yeah, working on the 4th, about to record the 2nd episode of the 4th season tomorrow, actually, at the time of
Nice.
this recording.
Nice. Well, and again, thank you for carving out some time just to chat with
Dude,
me.
absolutely. No, are you kidding? I'm glad this has been amazing, already. I I don't know a favorite.
Okay.
People have asked me before, and it depends on the day. Right
Yeah.
now,
Yeah.
the thing that gets me really excited is myth, and this idea that like, I don't think that myth is fiction. I
Mhm.
think that and that's why we don't call it fiction, we
Yeah.
call it something else. Um, but this idea that when you read the Homeric poems, when you read Virgil, and others too, not just those guys, but you're actually reading something historical that is presented through the lens of epic myth.
Yeah.
Um, and I was I was even reading in Bob Inc. recently in his volume 3 of his dogmatic. He's talking about how the antediluvian world, and the world just post deluge and post Babel was so radically insane, and different from what we would normally comprehend as normal that that like the pagan myths that we read from those times, um, should not be dismissed as nonsense.
Right.
Like that's part of where he was going with it. Um, and I think that it's true. Like I think that we can, and honestly, I mean, just to harp on Peterson, I think that Carl Jung was onto something with
Mhm.
this.
Mhm.
Um, when he talks about the collective unconscious, I don't think that that is true. But what I do think is true is that
Right.
man has sort of shared memories of its own history. I mean, man is an
Yeah.
organic, unified whole. We all came from one. We all came from Adam. And so I think that it's not ridiculous, especially when you look at different views of the propagation of the soul, to think like, oh, the reason that everyone cares about oak trees in regards to Jove is because Jove was real and
Yeah.
Jove was really into oak trees.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
The reason everyone has this archetypal idea of a river
Mhm.
daughter or an old man
Mhm.
willow or a dark tower that's
Yeah.
important,
Yeah.
Tower of Babel,
Right. Right.
is because we actually had all those things, and
Yeah.
in some cases maybe still do. And so I think, yeah, I've been really into this idea of, so there's ancient myth,
Yeah.
there's the common myths that we would think of, but then there's also more modern myth.
Yeah.
Um, Stuff like Tolkien's Legendarium, like that is a myth
Mhm.
of the English peoples.
Mhm.
Even C.S. Lewis's Narnia, um, or the Ransom trilogy, or Till We Have Faces. Like, I think that even modern myth, we should take with a grain of salt and say this isn't just mere fiction. There's something deeper and more real going on here than maybe we'd be comfortable admitting. I'm not saying that like Middle Earth is nonfiction. That's not what I'm saying. But I
Mhm.
am
Mhm.
saying that it's myth. It's something between fiction and nonfiction. It's
Yeah.
something that, I mean, look at it this way. Like, I believe Tolkien was a Christian, and I believe that any Christian man who dedicates his entire professional creative life to one single thing
Yeah.
is displaying a level of pathos and putting skin in the game, high stakes vulnerability, like what you're talking about, that is inappropriate if it was just all made up.
Mhm.
Like, I think that
Mhm.
Tolkien had a pathos that was driving him where he
Mhm.
was saying, "No, this matters for more than mere, cognitive power that fiction gives you. It matters for more
Yeah.
than mere moral principles that fiction
Yeah.
can give you. It matters because it speaks to something true that's deeply rooted in the history of humanity.
Yeah.
And that is that, and I'm sorry to be so cheesy, that the world is not just stuff. that there that there's histories, with fairies and gods and goddesses
Yeah.
that are that make us extremely uncomfortable because of our modern sensibilities, but that are nonetheless true. And all
Yeah.
of them, when they're redeemed appropriately, when they're read correctly, point to the true myth.
Yeah.
The myth that, like, no one would read the Bible and categorize it as like, "Oh, yeah, this is nonfiction." Like,
Right.
duh, it's nonfiction.
Yeah.
But it's far more than just nonfiction. It's
Yeah.
epic. It's mythical in its scope. It's
Yeah.
transcendent in all that
Yeah.
it means. So
Yeah.
anyway,
Well, and um yeah, that's wonderful. I heard you guys wrestling with this. So one of the things is my kids love your podcast, by the
oh
way.
man, thank you.
They are captivated by it. And I think that um is another clue to kind of what we're talking about is like we're made for this. We're made for
Mhm.
stories. We're
Yeah,
made for dialogue. And when you hear a good story, you know that there's more to it
yeah,
than just whatever fiction. Um, it sort of okay. So there's so much to talk about here.
I know.
Um, uh, Hermes. Okay, I'll start with Hermes, and then maybe go from there. The what Hermes teaches us, whether myth, fact, somewhere in between. Hermes was the messenger of the gods. Okay,
Mhm,
Hermes could deliver messages with great speed. Hermes was also a trickster. So you
mhm,
never quite knew, am I getting the right message? And the reason story, I think, is really important is that it allows for time. It allows for something like a preparation of the soul.
mhm.
And what sort of the myth of Hermes teaches us is that if the soul is not prepared, the message will be received incorrectly. Now, so if the soul is prepared, if Hermes comes and tries to trick me, I know because because of that preparation of the soul. Like I'm steeped in the true myth.
Yes.
So when the lie shows up, I'm like, nah, not so quick there, Buckaroo.
Doesn't smell
Um, it
good.
doesn't, yeah, it doesn't pass the smell test. It's like it's incoherent. It doesn't, correspond to reality. It's, there's all kinds of things that would happen, and so story. You've probably come into contact with this. I mean, I'm sure you have. I mean, I think I've read The Lord of the Rings a dozen times,
Yeah,
and it never gets old because it's a great story.
yeah,
Um, Certainly Bible passages are like this. Like you read a certain Bible passage, you're like, I do not get this.
yeah,
Like I have no clue what this passage is about. I couldn't even begin. And then I come across it a year later or 2 years later. I'm like, there it is. That's it. That's it. Whatever it was that it was like there needed to be a preparation.
yeah.
And so I think that's one of the things that stories do, even just like, sort of fiction stories, fantasy stories, Tolkien or
100%.
Lewis or whatever. Like we would not read them if they were just gibberish. Like
Right.
it has to contain truth, it has to contain sort of facts and information. Otherwise it would be incoherent. We wouldn't read it. So it's helping us. I think for me, it helps me read the Bible.
Yeah.
Now,
No, no, me too. Like,
yeah.
there's even, Tolkien and Lewis, they give away this conceit, this utilitarian use of their stories early on in both of their, like in Narnia and Lord of the Rings. Where in Lord of the Rings, uh, Frodo says, in regards to Strider, "I think that a servant of the enemy would seem fairer but feel fouler." So Frodo has the sniff test down. He knows, and it's
Yep.
because his soul has been properly prepared, to discern the good from the evil by
Yeah.
being immersed in the good, true, and beautiful of the Shire. Like,
Mhm.
the Shire is
Mhm.
peace. It's like it's a garden again, right? And then in Narnia, you have the juxtaposition between Lucy and Edmund in The
Yeah.
Lion and the Witch, where Edmund is fooled immediately by the witch, and even though he, like, has some kinda tinge deep down,
Mhm.
he
Mhm.
doesn't his soul isn't steeped enough
Yeah.
in what's warm and good and
Yeah.
true and beautiful for him to see, like, this is not right until it's too late. Lucy, on the other hand, immediately knows, even though she was kidnapped by a traitor, that, no, this man is trustworthy. This is what
Right.
repentance looks like.
Yeah,
His
yeah.
home is warm, his
Yeah.
voice is sincere, this
Yeah.
place is beautiful, and the witch is bad, and she just knows it.
Right.
I think that we're supposed to take those sorts of things, and then we're supposed to go back, and we're supposed to read in Hebrews where it says that, you've grown well practiced at discerning good from evil. You've practiced discernment.
Mhm.
That's a sign that you've gone from milk to solid food
Yeah.
spiritually.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And I think that we're supposed to take that passage in Hebrews and the lesson from Lord of the Rings and Narnia, and we're supposed to
Mhm.
say, "Oh, that's what it means." It
Yeah.
means that I can pick out the servant of the enemy because
Mhm.
of how foul he feels,
Yeah.
and how, like, yeah, he looks it's like the uncanny valley when you see, like, an AI image, and
Right.
you're just thinking, "Yeah, I mean, it looks really good,
But
but
it's
there's something is wrong."
yeah. Right. Right.
Something is just off,
W
and being willing to trust that kinda gut instinct of the soul
Yeah.
and let it guide you.
Yeah. Well, and I think that this takes me back to, like, what is the Bible, you know? What is it? It's not just history, you know? It
Right.
it contains history, and
Yeah.
I believe it contains true history, but it's not trying to just give you the history. It's not really trying to give you a history lesson. It's
It's
trying
not
to
a
teach you
textbook.
a theological truth, and it's using history to do that, let's say. And so I think that this sort of acknowledging of the sort of preparation that goes in, um, I think there's something to that, and I think it would help us to learn to read the Bible more because I think that this is why God revealed himself to us in a story. Now, when I say story, of course, I'm not saying it's made up, but it's if you
Yeah.
look at the content of the Bible, it's a narrative. It's a grand narrative. It contains all kinds of symbolism and metaphor and discourse, and of course it contains history and it contains facts. There's a quote from Martin Shaw that I thought was kind of appropriate. He says myths are true stories without the use of facts.
Mm.
um and Martin Shaw he's a mythologist and actually recently became an Orthodox Christian,
Nice.
um
Nice.
through
We
like a
got
through like a crazy experience. He had like this life-changing experience. Um, and I agree with that statement sort of in part. I think that, and of course he's the mythologist, I'm not. So what should I be saying?
sure.
I'm not trying to correct Martin Shaw here, but sort of like as I approach scripture, if I was to approach scripture with this idea, it would be that myths are true stories that are not relying on the facts to tell you that truth. It's like I have a
Mhm.
deeper truth to tell you, and because I have a deeper truth to tell you, I'm going to use the facts, but I'm not going to rely on those facts. I'm going to use poetic metaphor. I'm going to
Mm.
use, these, dialogue. You can think of the book of Job, it's like it's a discourse, it's a dialogue. Most of it's bad theology, but you're supposed to sift through it
Yeah.
and participate with it in order to understand that. Um, and so I think that's part of it. I think that God has revealed himself to us in this way because that's really the only way. Like he's
Yeah.
infinite and we're finite. And so there has to be this slow release mechanism. There
Right.
has to be this preparation of the soul that goes on for me to really truly understand God for who God truly is. Um yeah, I mean there's again,
That's
the world
even
is not just stuff,
yeah.
right? That's right. So God couldn't just give us just the facts.
Right. That
Um, yeah.
like, you're not gonna have scholars study for their whole professional lives Berkhof's single volume systematic theology.
Right.
Not because it's not a good work, it is a
Right.
great work, but
Right.
because it doesn't warrant that. But
Right.
you
Right.
will have hundreds of men dedicate their entire professional careers to figuring out C.S. Lewis
Right.
and the corpus that he wrote, both the fiction and the nonfiction, but especially the fiction. I think
Yeah.
that, and I think that it's because, like what you said, much of that quote from Martin Shaw is true. When when you're reading, like, let's take the Iliad for example. When you're
Mhm.
reading Homer's Iliad, you're getting thrown a lot of information. He's saying a lot of things. Now, it's decorated with amazing similes, and the language is beautiful. The mastery
Mhm.
of language even comes through in the English, even though it's not the the original language. It's
Right. Right. Right.
still beautiful and it's pleasant to read. But you're left at the end of it. The last line is, thus died Hector, breaker of horses, and you get to it, and you're like, wait, that's it? And why is that affecting me the way that it is? Why,
Right.
like, they didn't go to school to learn how to write good stories. They didn't go to creative
Mm.
writing classes. And yet they affected me
Mhm.
deeply. And I know that there's something more going on here than just Menelaus was mad that Paris stole Helen, and Paris is annoying, and Helen is selfish, and so there's a 10-year war,
Mhm.
and Hector dies, and Achilles wins glory. There's more going on. There's more to all of it than just merely the linear connection of the points in the story. It's a
Right.
nonlinear thing.
Right.
Fiction and myth, when it's done well, is completely nonlinear. It far outpunches
Right.
its weight class. It's greater than the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
And so, like, countless men have dedicated countless hours to figuring out what was Homer trying to say. What
Mhm.
was the point?
Mhm.
Like, what does this mean? I
Right.
know that it means something. It means a lot of things, but what
Right.
really, like, what is the point of all
Yeah.
this? And then,
Yeah. Yeah.
of course, you can answer that how you want, but I think one of the greatest modern examples of how this is still relevant and all of this is still happening is Lewis's Till We Have Faces. I think that Till We Have Faces is the best book that Lewis wrote,
Hmm.
and it's not even close. And I really love a
Yeah.
lot of Lewis's other books.
Yeah.
Uh, but Till We Have Faces is written by a Christian C.S. Lewis, and it is a purely pagan myth that takes
Mhm.
place in a
Mhm.
pre-Christ world where there is not a single shred of doctrine that is Christian that's given
Right.
in the book. But you get to the end of it and you finish reading it, and you think to yourself, this is one of the most Christian stories I've ever read.
Hmm.
Now, a non-Christian might not have that takeaway, but
Right. Right.
every Christian will if they're being honest with themselves. And it's because there's something deeper going on than, like you said, mere rationalism
Right.
with good stories and
Yeah.
good myth. It speaks to the peace of man that transcends mere rationality and it transcends mere reason. And that is the soul.
Yeah.
Stories have a way of this
Yeah.
is like the stories are soul food thing.
Right.
Because they are. Stories have a way of feeding and nurturing and lifting up the soul that
Mhm.
no amount of brute facts can ever achieve. It just
Yeah.
can't. And I don't know why. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend to, like, give you the mechanism as to why
Right.
that is, but we know that that is.
Well, and I think and this is part of the sort of the reenchantment of Christianity that at least I think I'm perceiving, um, is that we did ourselves a disservice by engaging in kind of the I don't know, sort of modern secular critique of maybe scripture or something like that. And so we moved into and systematic theology is great and we need systematic theology, but there was a lot of
Yeah.
like, okay, let's answer that question. Let's really figure it out and get real nuanced and at some point systematic theology just becomes kind of tiresome. Um, and if you think of Ian McGilchrist's Master and the Emissary Brain, he's taking this idea of the right and the left hemispheres of the brain and the different tasks that they do, and his conclusion is that like our modern world has brought us into this very left hemisphere centric
Hmm.
way of going through life, but it's also leading to this sort of meaning crisis. The left hemisphere is engaged in trying to grasp things, hold on to them, figure them out, sort of pin them down, make them understandable, sort of in kind of maybe even like a linear fashion. Whereas the right hemisphere is much more capable of engaging in abstract thoughts
Mhm.
and stuff like this. Um, and I think that I think stories do both. I think they engage both the left and the right hemisphere of the brain. But I think that we're sort of recapturing some of that right hemisphere, that sort of that even mystery would be kind of part of that. Like I
Yeah.
don't fully understand the thing, but that's okay. That doesn't mean it's not a thing. That doesn't mean it's not true. Um, and it doesn't mean there's not more to it than maybe my first impression, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of goes back to how do we read the Bible? You know, we've kind of taken it almost seems like we've sort of taken a systematic theology approach. And again, systematic theology, good. But then the things that we couldn't understand that are sort of mysterious or miraculous, we sort of went Jeffersonian Bible and we just went,
Yeah.
let's ignore that. Let's de-emphasize that. It's too like let's not preach it in our churches because it's strange and it's gonna take time to unpack. And then I think we have a whole generation of people who just don't know how to read their Bible
Yeah.
with regards to what we've been talking about, and realize like, okay, so as you were talking, I pulled up John chapter 19 because I think what I'm hearing you say is a good story does way more with a short sentence, than just give you the facts, right?
Yeah.
So I'm reading John 19, verse 41. Now, in the place where he was crucified, there was a garden, and in the garden, a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. Okay. He does a lot with that one sentence.
Right.
He does a lot. He takes us actually all the way back to the
To the
Garden of
garden.
Eden. The Garden of Eden had sort of this three-tier space. It's a
Yeah.
holy space, three tiers. Um, in the east, uh, whatever, yeah, so it's East, Eden, Garden, I think is
Yeah.
the way it goes in Genesis. Now in John 19, it's like there's the place he was crucified. That's one space. There was a garden. That's the second space. And in the garden, there was an empty tomb. That's the third space. So he takes us all the way back to just now. He also incorporates the temple with that because the temple is a recreation of that three-tiered
Right.
holy space. And what he's telling it, and then it's like, and then Jesus comes out of the ground, right? And he's alive and he's conquered death. And so it's like he again, sort of the way the Bible is written, it's like I could read that, that verse a lot. I could
Yes.
spend a lot of time on that one verse because of the mechanism or the device that's being used, because it is story, and again
Yeah.
I'm sort of using that term more broadly, because it is story, it does way more. It's way more dense.
Yeah.
um and I think part of the miracle of the Bible is that all of these stories are in conversation with each other, like these New Testament author, like he's clearly doing that on purpose. He's
Right.
trying to bring us back to Eden and then show us the resurrected Jesus. Like,
It's also how, like, you could someone who is reading John for the first time, and it's the first book of the Bible it's the first lick of scripture they've ever read. I firmly believe that, someone who's attentively reading John will get to that verse, having never read Genesis 1 and 2 and 3, and they will feel something deeper.
yeah, there's
They'll
something
sense
more.
there's something more to this. It matters that Christ was buried in a garden, that he rose in a garden. It matters that it's said in this way, that it's divided up in this way. And I think it's because I keep coming back to this. It's for the same reason that Paradise Lost is so effective.
Mhm.
When you get to the end of Paradise Lost and you come away with it, there's a sense of hopefulness. Yeah, it's a good story. But there's also a sense of something that you personally have lost,
Mhm.
but that you remember.
Right.
there, like, man has a sense of memory of what we messed up. We have, like, this is why
Mm.
people are sad when people die,
Yeah.
um, because we know that it's not supposed to be that way.
Yeah.
There's something more going on when a loved one passes away than the mere decaying and ending of a consciousness.
Right. Right.
There's real loss that we actually feel, an implicit responsibility for, because without the sin of our father, it wouldn't have happened, you know?
Yeah.
Um, and I think that that's working too. This is, this is why, one of the last things in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe it's so effective.
Mhm.
Even though I've never been there, it doesn't matter. He says, "The castle of Cair Paravel on its little hill towered up above them. Before them were the sands with rocks and little pools of salt water and
Mhm.
seaweed, and the smell of the sea and long miles of bluish green waves breaking forever and ever on the beach. And oh, the cry of the seagulls. Have you ever heard it?
Mhm.
Can you remember?"
You remember. Yeah.
And everyone reads it and they say, "Yeah." They say, "Yeah, I can remember that."
Mm.
There's something
Man.
like this, a sense of place,
Yeah.
um, a sense of objective beauty and good that has been lost.
Yeah.
It
And he
is
almost tells you more by not telling you everything.
exactly.
He leaves you there.
Somehow in text, he shows you without telling you, and it leaves you answering the question, "Yeah, I've heard it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can remember." It's beautiful. It speaks to an understanding of how
Mm.
human beings
Right.
work, that I think gets back to what you're saying with, like, left and right brain function.
Yeah.
Um, we have forgotten that, we as a society,
Yep.
and when you depend entirely on one part of what it means to be a person, this rational part,
Mhm.
which is
Mhm.
there, like,
Mhm.
that is a part of we can't neglect that. But when you focus solely on that to the neglect of other parts,
Yeah.
this, capacity for abstract thought and abstract beauty, uh,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
kind of escapes definition, then you will slowly lose the hearts of everyone
Yeah.
that you're trying to win.
Well, and I wonder, I would say that process that has happened in society by and large has also happened in the church. And I think we see it in the way m much of the Bible is preached maybe on, like, a Sunday. Like, I, I was sort of I was sort of joking with a friend of mine about, um we went to a conference, it was a youth conference, and all the people that gave presentations were young people. So they're all in the high school youth group. Um, and you could tell that they've been coached to sort of get what's the point? What's the
Mm,
takeaway? Here's the takeaway. Here's the takeaway. So they would say things like that. And it got to the point where I was like, I just kept every time a student got up and gave their presentation and said, here's the takeaway, I would look over at my friend and be like, or get ready. Here's the
yeah,
takeaway.
here's one.
Um, rather than being held by the story. Like, here's the story, and I want
Yeah,
to present it to you well. I want to be faithful to the narrative. And I may not tell you everything. Like, a good storyteller is not going to tell you everything, like what C.S. Lewis is doing.
yeah,
Um, and I do think there's parts of scripture that are just like that. And I wonder if, and again, I keep thinking back to this, like, reenchantment of Christianity. And that's maybe part of that is my own personal journey. Like, I got pretty burnt out doing ministry. Um, and then I went to Knox Theological Seminary,
mm,
and I actually took a year off. I was working at Starbucks, and I did a program called Christian Classical Studies. So we compared scripture, and we compared, like, Christian theology with some of what we've been talking about, some of these ancient texts, Plato, Aristotle, et cetera, and talked about how they've engaged in one long conversation. And after going through that program, I really felt like I had permission to read my Bible, um, with not just my sort of critical mind, like, I want to understand this, but with a sense of imagination involved. Like
Mhm.
I'm gonna place where am I standing here in this story? One of my favorite stories in the Bible is Jesus when he right before he heals the blind man Bartimaeus. So Jesus is in a crowd of people, right? And they're all calling him Jesus the Nazarene, right? So they look at Jesus and they're like, he's a Nazarene. He's just a guy from this place. They seem to have like a one-dimensional view of who Jesus is. Now they're following him around or whatever. They're curious about him, but so he's in the middle of this crowd of people who don't seem to understand who he is. In fact, in Luke's gospel, before this scene takes place, Luke re-emphasizes that the disciples really didn't understand Jesus. They didn't understand who he, like what his point was. And yet Bartimaeus, somehow he cries out, "Son of David." So he knows who Jesus is. The crowd doesn't know. The disciples don't know. They don't see Jesus for who he is.
But the blind man does.
The blind man see. And then what does Jesus say? He doesn't say bring him here. He calls Bartimaeus here. Come here. And Bartimaeus knows where Jesus is.
Yeah.
It doesn't say that anyone led him. But the blind man somehow in a crowd of people found Jesus. Like he saw Jesus, like he saw, and I'm air quotes here, like
Yeah.
somehow he knew where Jesus. It's just like, oh my gosh, man! Like I'm usually the person in the crowd. I think I see Jesus, but I
Yeah,
don't.
yeah.
I need to be Bartimaeus,
Right. Yeah.
the guy on the outskirts begging and
There's
and
so
and crying out, "Son of David, have mercy on me, a sinner." Um,
there's so
so
many layers to that too.
well, it's just like, and when you start to, and again, it was after going through seminary and after kind of like training, again, maybe that preparation of the soul, being sort of trained by these other stories.
Yeah.
I went back and realized, oh, these stories are good because that story is good. These
Yeah.
stories are good because they're engaging with the true myth,
Yeah.
the myth made fact.
It's
Um,
it's how Tolkien was able to share the gospel with Lewis. You know,
right, right,
Lewis is saying like, I can't accept that all these myths are just lies breathed through silver, you know.
yeah,
And Tolkien said, well, they're not.
they're not,
Of course they're not. Because
yeah,
they find their fountainhead in the one myth that is only true. And so therefore these myths are filled with small truths
yeah,
that are, put through confused human hands. It's
yeah,
really I've also been going back to like, and that even gets into what you were just saying with Bartimaeus, this idea that all of human history can be summed in the words from God to the serpent in Genesis 3. I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and you're going to bruise his heel.
mhm,
He's going to crush your head. Not only is that the story of all of human history,
yeah,
but it is the potential story of every individual person that ever lives. And so you get a man like Bartimaeus, who has been especially
mhm,
acquainted with the enmity between man and sin, man and the curse and the effects thereof.
mhm,
He's blind.
yeah,
Like, if he's not acquainted with the serpent, then I don't know who is. But though he's bruised, he sees the son of the one who played music and healed King Saul. You know,
mhm,
the only
mhm,
healer in the Old Testament was
yeah.
King David. And he's like, "Well, I've heard that he can heal others. He must be the son of David." It's as simple as that. And,
Right.
it's just it's amazing to me. A healer
Mhm.
king, it's
Yeah.
Aragorn,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
real.
Okay. Man, the whole Genesis 3 thing just opens up a whole nother thing, and I
I
know you probably need to wrap this up.
I
Um,
probably do, but
um,
I wish.
maybe part 2 or something, but it's fascinating to me. Okay.
Mhm.
Can I do 2 things here real quick?
Absolutely, yeah.
Um, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed. So it's the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman. So there's
Mhm.
this sort of good versus evil.
Yeah.
Just that whole
That's the
thing,
whole stage.
it plays out. You see it in Cain and Abel, but then you see it really profoundly in Genesis 6, and it just goes on. And I think when you fit that puzzle piece in, again, it's sort of like you sort of are able to read the Bible with fresh eyes and sort of, again, give yourself permission. I don't wanna, I'm not into, the Bible code stuff. It's like, if there's not a pattern, I don't wanna force the pattern, and
Mhm.
that's one of the things that I think stories, one of the reasons why I view the Bible as a story is that all stories kind of have their own guardrails. You know what I mean? It's like, yes, I'm using this symbolic language, but just because I'm using symbolic language doesn't mean that the symbol can just mean anything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's going to mean maybe 1, 2, 3. It could mean multiple things, but it can't mean everything. Like
Yeah,
the garden. Like John is clearly pointing us to this sort of 3 tiers, pointing us all the way. Like it tells you how to read the story.
yeah,
Um, and I think all good stories kind of do that. You can almost anticipate where the story is going once you sort of learn how to read it, I guess.
yeah,
Um, and so I don't know, I have this would be my encouragement. And I love this conversation. And I love that there's good people doing good podcasts. And I love that there's this whole, I don't know, movement, I don't know, season within the church that says, man, there's way more to the Bible than just systematic theology. Systematic theology is good, helps me
yeah,
understand it, but there's way more going on. And I
yeah,
actually tripped over it in Genesis 2. And it's that like the story goes that God commands Adam, right? From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. From the day you eat of it, you'll surely die. Okay, very familiar. Eve has not been created yet.
mhm.
When Eve retells that story, if you will, we'll call it a message because that's really the
Sure.
message. God gives Adam this message about the garden. Here's how things work in the garden. You're familiar with the animals, you're familiar with the plants, and this one tree, like you could build a clubhouse in it. You could
Yeah,
have a picnic under it, but you just can't eat the fruit of it.
yeah,
When Eve tells that to the serpent, she says, "We can't touch it."
mhm.
Well, where did she get that idea? It must have come from Adam, I would think. I mean, maybe she made it up, but Adam's there with her
Right.
during this temptation. And so he doesn't correct her.
Yeah,
So he mishandles the story. He mishandles the message that he received from God. He doesn't steward the message to Eve well. I
mm,
think he just gets annoyed. He's like, "Here's the horses," and she asks all kinds of questions about horses. "Here's the palm tree." She asks all kinds of questions about the palm tree. "Here's the fish," "Here's the ocean. This is how things work. Those are the stars. That's called moon." He sort of goes through the whole process. And of course, I'm imagining this, right? Of talking about this to Eve, and then he gets so tired of all the questions that when it comes to the knowledge of good and evil, he's just like, "Just don't touch it.
yeah.
Just don't
Just,
touch the thing."
don't even think about it.
And you see this tendency even with us. It's like God gives us the law that allows us to live in harmony with Him, and we put more law on top of it. And because
Mm,
I don't want to eat of that. I don't want to be tempted to eat that fruit.
yeah,
So I'm going to say, let's just not even touch it.
right.
And we actually mishandle the message,
Yeah.
And so it almost seems like human history is fought between those who are mishandling the message and those who are faithful stewards of the message.
Yeah,
The seed of the woman, the seed of the serpent. Because of course, the serpent reinforces, and see, again, this goes back to the preparation of the soul. Like, if this if this if the message isn't received, deception can come in. If the message isn't received well, then
right.
you're vulnerable to the deception of that serpent. And
That's
she
right.
goes,
Like,
"Huh, I never, well, why don't I, touch it?" And then nothing happens. Oh, well, I must be
yeah,
able to eat it.
yeah. It's like there's nothing inherently wrong with placing extra guardrails to help yourself if you're especially tempted. Um,
Hmm,
sin had already occurred before Adam and Eve fell. Satan was the first one to sin, and he
right.
did it in the
Rebellion.
presence of God
Right.
Himself, in the fullness of God's glorious presence, somehow. And And so it's not like there was no temptation
Yeah.
before the first sin. That would take away all the risk, all the
Yeah.
tension of the story would be gone. And man would no longer be the author of his own sin. We would implicate God in the authorship
Yeah.
of sin. But yeah, there's this weird thing where you also have, so you can have that. Like I can say to my son, "Hey, buddy, don't push your brother." You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's mean. Uh, and you're disobeying if you do. And he goes and he gets his hands like right up. I'm not pushing him.
I'm not
Or he
pushing.
like puts his hand on his shoulder. I'm like, yeah, but also don't push the limit.
Right.
Don't push the limit. That's
Yeah.
also
Yeah.
not obedient.
Yeah.
So there's room for that. But then there really is like, I
Mhm.
think you're totally right. God did not arbitrarily pick the words
Yeah.
that he said. He
Right.
meant them. They were perfectly chosen. And when we try to put our own man-made extra
Mhm.
guardrails, I mean, being charitable, calling them guardrails,
Right. Right.
with all good intention around the words that God's given us, we are actually setting our people up for failure
Yeah.
because they will be ill-equipped. Like part of why the serpent's deception was so effective is because Eve never heard God say. She never heard God actually say. She heard Adam tell her what God said, and Adam apparently told her something that God didn't actually say.
Yeah.
The deception was very now, I don't think Adam was lying because then that would have been the first sin. I think Adam was trying to be careful and he was trying to
Right.
help, but the serpent was able to use that. And like it's so there's so much cunning going on.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It is the most important, like apart from the incarnation and resurrection, which the incarnation is the strangest thing that has ever happened.
Yeah.
And the resurrection is the most important thing.
Hmm.
But apart from that, that story in Genesis is the most important thing. And
Yeah.
everyone should know it cold in their bones.
Yeah.
Because if you don't,
Yep.
you're really putting yourself at risk.
Yeah. But again, if it's not that, if you have not feasted on the word, right? If you haven't ingested it, um, then you are susceptible to that deception, as
Right,
we all are, which maybe takes us back to the community conversation.
right.
If
Yeah,
you're holding the word, if I'm holding the word, what does the Holy Spirit do? The Holy Spirit is the teacher, right? And so you've got, we all are in this process of listening to one another. Again, why we need to be vulnerable. I'm going to go ahead and share crazy ideas that sort of make sense to me, but where I am in error, I want my brothers and sisters in Christ to say, "Well, hold on, have you thought about it like this?
yeah,
Like maybe that's not quite what's going on." And then I get to sort of come back and rethink it. And I think that that's where, again, um, community is key. And I wonder if there's just that we live in a world that's so inundated with deception that's like that's why there's all these like podcasts showing up, and
yeah,
that's why you have a lot of people with participating in this stuff. And I think it's ultimately, I mean, I guess it's for the good because I believe in a sovereign God. But there's a part of this that is, I need the community of the body of Christ to help me, make sure I'm ingesting the word and ingesting it well,
yeah,
and then sharing it well.
yeah,
And as teachers, it's like, yeah, I need to be careful even of what I share, and share it. And some of the stuff that I'm maybe still working through, make sure people understand I'm still working through this. I don't know this to be, you
yeah.
know, um, yeah, well,
Not making any
100%.
definitive statements. Yeah,
Right, yeah, a
yeah.
definitive, yeah. Um,
Amen.
awesome. Well, it's uh, I always feel like there's more to say.
I know there.
Always feel like there's more to say. So
I think we're supposed to feel that way.
or more to hear,
Yeah.
as a good listener. So, anyway, man, thank you for your time. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it. Um,
It's a huge blessing. This is one of the most enjoyable, thought-provoking conversations I've had in a long time. I
wow, I
thank
appreciate that.
no, thank you very much.
No, it's good, man. It's good.
And thank you if you have made it here to the end. I really appreciate it. And hopefully this is stirring something in you, and I would love to hear more about it. So if you have hung in there to the end, that probably means that you've got something to contribute. And I do think we're kind of living in sort of enchanted times, and doing this podcast has filled me with a lot of joy, and you guys are a part of that. So thank you for being here, and I'll catch you in the next one.